Hey everybody, this is Rybo at the bench, and today I'm bringing you another pocket knife review, this time of the CRKT Squid. I have been very excited to review this guy. I've had my eye on this knife for quite a while because I think it's a cool looking blade, and I finally found one locally for a good price, so I thought I would grab it up and review it. Alright, so let's get into it. Alright, so in terms of price, you're looking at under 20 bucks. I found it on sale, so I paid significantly less than that actually, but around $18, $19, somewhere in there. And that'll also depend on what version you get. This is the black stonewash version. I think there's also a satin finish. You can see some CLP in there that I've been trying to loosen up the pivot a little bit. You can also get this in, I think, a carbon fiber variety as well. Obviously, this is a frame lock, so the carbon fiber will only be on this side, but that's to be expected with frame locks. So you know, very affordable knife. You know, you're kind of getting what you expect in terms of steel. So this is 8 CR13 MOV, which is just your budget Chinese steel. You know, which is fine for the price point. It comes very, very sharp out of the box, so I was very impressed with that. Size comparison. So this is a very small knife. You know, it's very stout, but it is small. So I'll bring in the Gerber Paraframe Mini that I have reviewed before, and you can see that these are kind of on par. The Paraframe is definitely not as stout as the Squid, but you know, the length is very similar. Also bring in the Kershaw Skyline, just to, you know, give you a size comparison of the knife. Obviously it's a lot bigger, but two, just the blades are very similar. I've talked about how much I really like the Kershaw Skyline blade, and the same goes for the CRKT Squid. I mean, the blades are very similar. This is just a stubbier version, but I think it's just a fantastic blade. It's got that nice hollow grind. It's nice and broad with that kind of clip point, or swedge, I guess you'd call it, up at the top. And I think it just works very well for kind of everyday carry tasks. And then, just because it is becoming a staple on my channel, and I hope to continue that because of how ridiculous it is, let me bring in the Hoffman Richter HR15 10-ounce knife, just to give you an idea of what you could really have for the $25. All right. So let's talk overall features first, and then we'll get into kind of some of the details. So like I said, this is a frame lock knife. This is steel on both sides, and obviously a steel blade. So this is going to be a heavier knife. I believe it comes in around 3.4 ounces, which is not terrible, but when you consider the fact that it is so small, you know, it is considerably heavier than something like this, which just feels like a feather in my hands after carrying this for a while. That said, it is very solid, so you know, you can beat this guy up and not worry too much about it. One of the things that contributes to that weight is the fact that it has this lanyard hole slash, I don't know, bottle glass breaker maybe thing here. You know, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but that is just a solid piece of some kind of steel. This has a fairly deep carry clip, so if you consider carrying this guy, you're looking at that right there, which is pretty good. Although, you know, one of the issues that I really have with this knife is I just don't understand this up here at all. You know, one, I think this would have been a perfect deep carry office knife, except for the fact that basically with this deep carry clip, when you add the lanyard hole, you're not really getting anything for that. When you look at something like the Ontario Rat 2, if you know, do that, that's about what you're getting there when you consider this little kind of lanyard hole thing. And you could go down the line with the Kershaw Skyline, the Delica, some of the other knives that just kind of illustrate that. If you take this little, you know, whatever you call this thing out, I mean, that would be a great deep carry option, but unfortunately it's just not. But anyway, this is a thumb stud action knife. So you can see the closed profile is very nice, very uniform, and so you deploy with that thumb stud. I'll talk about that in another second. And other than that, pretty basic knife. I mean, you know, it's I think very aesthetically appealing. It's just I think a nice design knife. Has some jimping both up at the top here and on that frame lock. Yeah, and overall, I think it looks very nice. All right, so let's talk ergonomics, and unfortunately, this is where we start to get into the very disappointing of this knife. So ergonomics for such a small knife are not completely awful until they are. And what I mean by that is this knife had a lot of potential, and if there were just some small things changed with this knife, the ergonomics would be pretty good considering the size of this knife. So the finger choil is actually really nice. Your finger just slides kind of right in there. Although the frame lock here kind of extends, let me see if I can show that, extends over this kind of double finger choil. And so when you're holding it, you really feel that rubbing right here up against your finger, and it kind of creates a hot spot. Other than that, ergonomics, are pretty good in that you can get 3 fingers plus your thumb up here, except for the fact that this thing again, I mean, this is just a very kind of angular, hard-lined, lanyard hole, whatever you want to call it, and it just digs into your hand the wrong way, and it drives me insane. It is not very comfortable. It kind of hurts anytime your hand rubs against that. And otherwise, the knife would have been nice and round at the end, and at least allowed you to kind of cup your hand around the end of it. Unfortunately, now when you do that, it kind of digs into your palm and is just very uncomfortable. So that I really don't like at all. I'll talk about the ergonomics of deploying this knife, and so we'll get into kind of the lockup. And that's probably the most disappointing thing to me about this knife. I can excuse a lot of other things, and I can even excuse the fact that this has plastic washers. Let me see if I can get a picture of those. There you go. Let me see if I can get that in focus, actually. There you go. So you can see the plastic washers on both sides. Now, I don't expect a whole lot different, especially for a knife that's under 20 bucks. Basically, that just means that this knife is very stiff. However, due to the fact that it's so small, and this thumb stud, there's not a ton of space between the frame and the thumb stud here. This knife is ridiculously difficult to deploy. So I can sit here and kind of push it open, and that looked pretty easy, but I've been practicing this quite a bit with this knife. But the thumb stud really tends to dig into your finger here, and it's just not very comfortable. Add to the fact that there's no G10, so there's no real grip to this knife. It's just basically the bottom of this knife is going to be pushing into your palm, and again, that wouldn't necessarily be an issue, except for this lanyard hole down here is very uncomfortable. So all that goes to say, you're pushing down in your palm, you're trying to dig in and push this thumb stud up, and a lot of times that's what ends up happening, especially because those plastic washers don't really help at all with the with the pivot action. I did spray some CLP in this, and I guess it's worked a little bit in loosening it up, but it's just not going to do a ton with plastic. This knife is ridiculous. This is going back to this Hoffman Richter. But the nice thing about this knife is, while there is plastic on one side, and if I can get a picture of that, one of the washers in this knife is actually brass, which is pretty cool for such an inexpensive knife. And it looks like it's not going to really show that. But you can see in person, at least, that the washer on this side is brass or some kind of metal, which just makes the knife a lot smoother. Unfortunately, the CRKT Squid is not the same. I can't imagine that this is really going to loosen up over time because those washers are plastic. Okay, so in addition to that, I have one other major gripe about this knife. For everything that I've said about the pocket clip and how much I really enjoy deep carry pocket clips, and this one's fine for what it is, the fact that this knife is so small means that when you are trying to deploy this knife, you have it kind of digging into your palm there. You're kind of pushing pretty hard up against this thumb stud that's not super comfortable. And on the back side, your fingers are basically pushing down on this pocket clip. And and it is just very uncomfortable, and I'm kind of shocked that I haven't heard more people complain about this. It's the first thing I noticed, and even after days of carrying this and trying to deploy it, it drives me crazy. And I don't know if it's my hand size or what, but anytime I'm trying to deploy this knife, all I'm feeling is digging into my palm here and digging into my finger here, and it just is awful. It's the least comfortable knife that I've ever tried to deploy, and I just don't see it getting much better. I've tried to practice it. I can usually get it out a little bit more, but it does kind of take a wrist flick to deploy this knife, at least in my opinion, kind of like that. All right, so steel I've talked about. I was very happy with the edge that came on this knife. It is a very sharp edge. You know, it's probably going to need sharpening quite a bit more, and you can see that it does have a little sharpening choil there, which is very nice. But yeah, the steel is kind of what you'd come to expect. The blade profile I like quite a bit because I'm also a big fan of the Kershaw Skyline, and they're just very similar blade profiles. I think this is just a great kind of beat up everyday carry utility knife. You can use it for prying, you can use it for cutting, slicing, what have you. The lockup, you know, once you master kind of deploying this knife, the lockup is quite good. You know, I am not a big fan of frame locks, but this one does lock up, you know, pretty nicely. You can kind of see, if I can get this in frame, you can see that it is kind of slanted there a little bit, and the frame is grooved, and so it does lock up pretty nicely. I don't really have much concerns about this steel kind of backing out, and I think it's just hard enough to you know, take this knife down. It's kind of right where I want it. I don't want a knife, you know, a frame lock to be too easy to push over and take down, obviously, because that is just a weak knife, and I don't want it to be too uncomfortable either. I think this one is actually just fine. All right, so besides that, you know, I'm very happy that at least they use Torx on here, so you can take the knife down, except if you'll notice, so the pivot screw is Torx, and the pocket clip is Torx, and I believe the this back kind of lanyard hole, you know, is Torx. But this guy right here is not, and if you look at this side and if you look at the other side, neither one have any way that I can see to take them down, and so I don't really understand that at all for such a cheap knife, for something that is, you know, a deep carry knife and supposed to be this kind of everyday beater. I would think that you would want the option to take the knife down. But from what I can see, that would be very difficult. My last kind of gripe with this knife has to do with just overall fit and finish. You know, overall, I would say the knife is not terrible. You know, I really like the look of it. I like the black stonewashed look. But unfortunately, there are a couple things on mine that just scream cheap Chinese knife. So the first is this double-sided thumb stud. So this is clearly, once you actually play with this in person, this is clearly just a thumb stud with you know, something that goes through on both sides and is keeping it tight together, because you can actually sit here, and I don't know if that's coming across in camera, but you can sit here and move this thumb stud up and down. And it's not fit very well in there, and so what that means is when you're trying to deploy this knife, you're actually feeling this thumb stud kind of move around, and it, you know, practically speaking, doesn't mean a whole lot, but it's super annoying, and it just makes you think cheap knife. So that's one thing. The second thing, you know, that's more of a, not cosmetic, but that's more of just a kind of an annoyance. The second thing that's actually an issue, and I believe this is why this knife is not very smooth, is that this knife is not it's not parallel. So the frames here are not parallel, and I hope that's coming across on camera. But if you'll notice, you know, let's use this Gerber to kind of simulate the bottom frame, and we'll use this Skyline to simulate the top frame. So obviously in a knife you want these to be as parallel as they can be, because the washers in between the knife are acting as friction and opening that blade. What's happening in this knife is that it's actually like this. So the frame in the back of this knife is much tighter than it is in the front, and I think you can see that. So it kind of forms this V. And what that means is there's a lot of pressure being put here and not a whole lot here. And so I think that is just kind of adding to the issue with the plastic washers. In person it's really clear, and it almost even looks like this washer is a little bit larger than this one. To me, that's just unacceptable in any knife, and it's never really going to get better. You think about something like your Spyderco Delica, which is a this is a lockback knife. This knife comes very stiff, but over time, over the first couple weeks, it really does loosen up, and so it's just falling closed. The same will not be true for this knife due to the fact that they're plastic washers and due to the fact that these are not in parallel. Tightening up the pivot, loosening up the pivot has not seemed to help with that so far. So overall, cutter carry, unfortunately this is going to be a cut for me, and I really hate that because I really liked this knife when I was researching it online. It's only when I got it and have been using it that I've really grown to dislike it, and it's too bad because I think the blade, I think the overall knife aesthetic design is just fantastic. Honestly, I've given the Gerber Paraframe Mini a bad review before, but I would much rather have this if I'm looking for a smaller knife, just because of the fact that it's like half as heavy, and at least I know I'm not deploying it, and the action is a little bit better. So unfortunately, this is going to be a cut for me. But as I recommend to a lot of people, if you don't enjoy a knife, don't have it just sitting in a drawer. Sell it so someone else can enjoy it and you can get something that you're actually going to enjoy using. So I will be selling this knife, but I am glad that I got to review it, and I hope that this has been helpful for you. Thanks everybody. See you next time.